Hello and welcome to Witty-Banter. I'm your host, Marie Ryan. The topic today is the outlook of social media in 2024. Joining me today is Mo Shehu, whose name I've woefully mispronounced. He's the founder of thecolumncontent.com. Hi, Mo. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Marie. It's good to be here.
Great. Excellent. So, first of all, who do you have?
So I like to joke that my ideal customer is an overworked marketing director at a seed to Series B startup. Keyword overworked because the idea is column content comes in and does a lot of organic and some paid content here for B2B clients specifically. So the clients that we help are typically marketing directors. We're looking to scale their departments, scale their teams, scale their content operations, but they either don't have the in-house resources to do so, or they need an outside consultant who can sort of help them strategize how to go through it.
Okay, great. And the topic today is the social media, particularly for 2024. What type of content is working well these days?
Well, if you take a look at LinkedIn, if you spend more than 5 minutes on LinkedIn, you'll see that it's mostly hot takes and memes. And I think it's working because people are kind of tired of what I can call the self-proclaimed thought leader. And so they want someone who's speaking from the trenches, so to speak, and someone who can also entertain as they educate. So I've seen a lot of success with that. Educational content still works for sure, but companies need to move from a generic advice model into a this is how we've done things and this is what has worked for us. And here's what other people in our space are doing as well.
Okay. And how do you think it'll change in 2024?
I would think it'll probably be more of the same, just drifting towards authenticity of experience again, rather than generic advice. So we're seeing more people wake up from this idea that people don't just want to read another top 10 list. They want to read about what you've done and how you've helped different clients before. So as clients shift into 2024, I think emphasizing that experience from the trenches is probably going to do a lot. It's probably going to have a lot more impact on your KPIs, on your engagement, on your views, on your impressions than anything else.
Why do you think people resonate with people from the trenches rather than the information or the education pieces?
I think because it's more hard-won advice. So, anybody can go to Google and scrape a top 10 article and turn that into a LinkedIn post, and that has its place. But it hits different when, someone like Marie is saying, here's a client that I worked with and we worked with them over 6 months. And this is what we crafted for these social media platforms. And here's why that didn't work. I think that's another thing that's super important. People want to hear why things did not work. And I feel like because we spend a lot of time on social media, we've gotten into this mindset of carefully curating everything we've done. But people want to see the ugly bits. They want to see the failures, especially failures. Failures are listening very well. When I work with clients for ghostwriting, for example, or executive communications, the one thing I tell them is talk a lot more about your failures. You got to where you are, not because you won every step of the way, but because you failed many times before you got there. So all the stuff that failed, that's where the juice is. That's where the story is. Talk a lot more about that. And people can resonate with that a lot more because many times you've got other people who've tried the same thing and maybe they didn't have the same results or they had similar failures and it just helps them feel like kinship, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, when we're on social media, we have a lot of bravado. LinkedIn is thankfully a little bit more authentic, I think, but definitely platforms like Instagram, it's the show reel and nothing else. So everyone is almost like a superhero leading a superhero life where they get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, they drink protein juice and they're working out all day and then they're working 12 hours in their jobs. Then they come home and spend another 12 hours with their kids and they work a few side hustles as well. And it lacks any kind of realism. So I think people are more interested in the authenticity, for want of a better word. But even that's becoming a jargony word now too. But yeah, the failures. Like if you do have, say, a successful startup and you're successful in your family and you have a bunch of hobbies, you must have worked really hard to do that and you must sacrifice a lot. So I think people are aware of that and they're more willing to believe it if they hear about the failure, the sacrifice, or if you're very successful, how many mistakes did you make before you learned the winning formula? Not just what we're led to believe on social media, that the person posting is so gifted that they were born with the winning formula without even trying.
Absolutely. There's a fitness client that I worked with a few years back, and the one thing she taught me was vulnerability is a superpower. And that has never been more relevant for social media, LinkedIn specifically. And I say this because, I mean, on Instagram, it's pretty easy for you to not post anything and you can just sort of lurk. But on LinkedIn, because there's almost a direct impact on your professional career advancement from your content, everyone is incentivized to present themselves as being the biggest winners in their space. And so there is a distinct lack of authentic vulnerability, and vulnerability coming from, I'll give you an example. Someone will say, I'm a CMO. And in my first 90 days, here's where I messed up. I came in, I tried to change XYZ, and that didn't work for these reasons. Now, anybody who's not just at the CMO level with you, but anybody who's maybe a level down, they can sort of look at that post and go, okay, this person is self aware enough to recognize that they're not superheroes. So that is automatically somebody I can trust, someone I can look up to, someone whose advice I can take a little bit more seriously than anyone else. And it's that lack of vulnerability. And ironically, the more vulnerable you're willing to be in your content, especially on LinkedIn, the better you perform somehow because no one else is doing it. And by definition, no one else ends up looking as human as you do.
Yeah, it makes sense. Our vulnerabilities are what makes us human. And certainly people are always looking to connect emotionally. So if you talk about a failure and how you felt about it, I think it will resonate more deeply. But with vulnerability in social media, you do need to be careful of how much you're putting out about yourself. Particularly, I find, again, not so much on LinkedIn, but in other platforms, there's a real victim narrative out there where it's like everything was stacked against me and I overcome them all. And it's almost like they think they're the hero of some fantasy fiction story. Thankfully, LinkedIn isn't like that at all. It's a much more professional space and people are a lot more balanced, I think. But how do you find a balance between being vulnerable and opening up and then sharing way too much, like with the other platforms?
So I think that goes back to why I said authentic vulnerability, because I know it's very easy for people to play the victim in their own story and everyone's a hero in their narrative. And it's pretty easy, I would think, to spot when someone is being authentically vulnerable and when someone is looking for sympathy or attention in a way that they shouldn't be looking for that. There's usually an element of reflection. There's usually an element of this thing happened to me. And while that is unfortunate, I'm not going to play the woe is me card. I can sort of understand part of why it happened. I can understand maybe the role that I played in it. And here's how I thought about going towards solving that problem. And here's then what happened next. So there's an element of culpability, an element of accountability in what happened to you. Whereas with people who are looking for sympathy and, undue attention from platforms like LinkedIn and Instagram and all these other social media platforms, for them, it's just the decks was stacked against me and I am a total victim. And oh my God, I couldn't have seen this coming. Why me? The world is so terrible. Everything is so bad. And then it just sounds a little bit whiny and complaining. And people can pick up on that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So for people who do want to be a little bit more vulnerable and authentic online, how do they get started? Because I think it's getting started is the hard part. It's like there's a lot of resistance there for most people. So how do you get over that and then start building like a personal brand?
So I'll answer this question by asking you one question in return. If you walked into a restaurant and the Marie from 10 years ago was sitting at a booth, you walked up to her and you have to give her one piece of advice, what would you say?
Keep going. That would be my advice to her.
Keep going. Okay. Why should she keep going? What happened that made you arrive at that?
It takes a bit of like turmoil and moving through things to figure out your right path. And sometimes like a fork in the road or a red flag or something that you think is bad is actually setting you up for something else. So while you're in the thick of it, it doesn't feel all that great. But if you keep on going, it's about to get much better. The worst thing will be to get lost in that victimhood. Oh, woe is me. But you can really use it and you generate so many skills from that and it puts you on the correct path.
Beautiful. Now, There are millions of younger Maries out there going through that exact same situation you've just described. And that thing that you would say to your younger self is what they crave. That's what they would want to hear on LinkedIn. And so when you talk about building a personal brand, when you talk about finding the right balance between being too open versus being vulnerable versus being caged, it's really just about look into the mirror and talk to yourself, talk to your past self. And you're going to find an audience by definition because you have been that person and there are other people out there just like you. And if you do that, if you did only that, you wouldn't ever need to think of content because then you can just look back on your life and go, this thing happened to me 5 years ago. Here's what I learned. This thing happened to me 6 years ago. Here's what I learned. When I was starting my career, this is what was going through my head. 10 years later, this is what I've realized. And you're being vulnerable because you're sharing information about your life, but really you're also teaching and empathizing with anybody who's who's walking the same path with you. And you can build a really, really powerfully large and engaged community that way, just doing that.
It sounds really simple. You're just giving advice from your own frame of reference. And then, like that, if it's something that you really believe, it would have that air of authenticity. And yeah, yeah, I like it. It sounds good. I know you advise businesses to focus on one platform first, especially while they're smaller. Why should businesses focus on one platform only?
I think it really just depends on how much what we can call pressure you're able to exert on a platform. So if we define pressure as the amount of time, money, energy, resources, thinking, strategy that you can apply to it, if you're a young startup, you don't have a lot of resources on hand, it's usually advisable for you to go for just the one platform and the one platform, ideally where your ICP hands out. So that's not always LinkedIn, but for a lot of the B2B clients that we work with is LinkedIn. So go all in on LinkedIn, get your whole team on LinkedIn. The founder should almost always be on LinkedIn. I can't think of a good reason why the founder should never be on LinkedIn because that person is the first the first ambassador of the brand. So the customers want to trust you. So go all in on LinkedIn. But if you have a bit more money to play with, if you have a bit more resources, a bit more time, if you're not pressed for quarterly results, for example, then you can think a little bit long term, then you can expand a little bit and then diversify the type of channels that you play with. So maybe you can do LinkedIn and a newsletter or LinkedIn and SEO. You can start a blog or you can do a blog and maybe a podcast, sort of like what you're doing right now. Ideally, I would say think in terms of a pyramid. And so what that means is if you've got one channel at the top, let's say this podcast that you're doing now, Marie, with this podcast, you can then create content for LinkedIn, your newsletter, your blog. You can create sales enablement content. You can do a survey because if you speak to 100 such founders and senior leaders, you're going to collect a lot of insights. Over the course of a year, if you've spoken to one leader a week, that's a sample size of 52 top senior leaders. If you've asked them the same set of questions, you now have a data set that you can draw a report off of. So when you think of it that way, you begin to realize that how do I leverage or how do I apply the most leverage to the most impactful and most important channel and use that to generate content for every other channel down the pyramid?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think there's a tendency for businesses and particularly people who are maybe just getting started with their marketing to take a scattergun approach to their promotion. So they've heard about SEO and know what it is, so they want to do a bit of that. They know social media, and if they're older, they may have heard of the Facebook or the LinkedIn, and they want to get started with those too. They want to be on Instagram, even TikTok and Snapchat chat for reasons unknown. You're better off to figure out who your customer is, where they are, and then find them there. If it's a B2B company, it's probably LinkedIn. Whereas if it's more of a retail product, it could be Instagram or it could be Facebook. But focus all your efforts into that. And then, like that, as you say, you can cross purpose your content. So, blogs also make great newsletter content. But equally, podcasts are very, very versatile because after a podcast, I can create videos from it very easily and then a blog as well, which is also good for the newsletter. So it's one piece of content up front, but you get a lot more out of it. And it's relatively straightforward to turn that one piece of content into lots of other different types of content too. Great. And one thing we often hear about too is social. How important are case studies and testimonials for businesses and for solopreneurs?
I think it sometimes depends on what it is you're selling and how far along in your journey you are. So Nowadays, it feels almost non-negotiable to have case studies and testimonials. The problem is it presents a bit of a chicken and egg problem. If you're brand new to the market and you don't have any case studies, where do you start getting case studies? Because you can't get customers if they don't see that you've helped other people, but other people aren't going to help you help them if you don't have case studies. And so it's very easy to find yourself, going around and round in circles. I think one easy way is to work on a project for your ideal client. This could be something as easy as an audit, right? Just going into the systems, helping them understand where they might be going wrong, giving them some strategy of how they can improve, and then tracking that change down the line. That automatically gives you one case study to start with. Audits are usually the easiest. And then as you do more work, you then augment that case study with new work that you've done, new projects that you've successfully completed, and then getting testimonials from that. One of my favorite things to do is if you worked with the client for a while and you've done a good job for them and they're very happy with it, get them to give you a LinkedIn recommendation because that LinkedIn recommendation is automatically a testimonial. You can also add to your website. But then even if you never have a website, if anybody goes to your LinkedIn profile, they're going to see all the testimonials from all the clients you previously worked with. And that helps you with the social proof aspect.
And how is AI affecting content creation?
I think AI is one of those buzzwords that everyone is getting all up in a tizzy about. It doesn't change the fundamentals of marketing, I'd say. I think if you've got good fundamentals, you've got a great product, it's solving a painful problem, you've got customers who are problem aware and solution aware, AI is only going to help you do those things faster in terms of convincing and converting customers over to your cause. But if you have a terrible product, if you don't have the fundamentals right, if your pricing is opaque or, it's just not right for the customers that you're targeting, if you don't really have a lot of success stories behind you, you could have OpenAI's neural engine and it still wouldn't help you grow a successful business. And so anybody who's thinking about AI should be thinking about, is our business in a solid enough place, first of all? I'll give an example with content. One of the first use cases for AI that we saw in the B2B space, the B2B marketing space, was in content marketing. As I'm sure you've also experienced that as well. And, we're talking about, is AI going to get rid of content writers? Is SEO dead? And you hear all these little platitudes on LinkedIn and it's like, what is content marketing? It's about helping a business showcase its product and solve problems for customers. Content just happens to be one channel through which it is done. Therefore, if you are educating your customers and helping them to understand the scale of the problem and the costs of inaction and the benefits of working with you, AI can then help you create content that speaks to those things faster. But if you don't have those things to talk about in the first place, no amount of chat GPT is going to help you because you already don't know where you're going. A fast car in the wrong direction is going to crash.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. A lot of people do seem to think that AI and like ChatGPT are going to replace a lot of marketing people, but really, I think they'll create, it'll be easier to create a higher volume. You still need somebody who has some technical expertise in writing and also in whatever product it is the company is selling to validate the content because ChatGPT doesn't know if it's right or wrong, but hopefully a human does. So you'll need somebody to read those things before they go live and to edit things and make sure things are correct. So the volume will increase. I think people in general, when they're online, are expecting a more targeted and tailored approach. Like the way we search for things in the search engine, you'd swear Google was a person you were speaking to. I think that's going to increase because the volumes of content are increasing fairly swiftly. So people will expect more targeted results. But I think there's huge opportunities because it's still new to a lot of people. And you're always going to need people who know how to use those apps, the AI tools, and which ones are useful for which scenario. So there are opportunities for people who want to develop themselves in that space, whether it's content marketing or even a completely different discipline. But I do think there's a lot more opportunities for people than we think so far.
When you've been using AI yourself, Marie, how has that made its way into your workflow?
It depends on the thing. So I've used ChatGPT for fun. It's a good place to start researching, but I would never use it to write an article. I do use it things like say captions for videos is really useful. And in some cases it can be useful for editing videos, but a lot of the time it's too it's not as good as a human, so it never really replaces anything. I don't really use it too much. I prefer the tools that I currently use. I like to play around with the AI tools, but for me, they haven't really replaced anything apart from like adding captions and a couple of other things that I use it for now and then. But maybe you're more well up on it than I am. Have you used AI and found any tools to be particularly beneficial in your workflow or even recommended them to your clients?
So I think where AI really shines is getting rid of some of the what we can call grunt work. And what I mean by this, one use case that I've been playing around with over the past couple of weeks is if I see a really, really nice thread on LinkedIn, right? Let's say Marie posted a great point and it's got like 100 different comments from all these thought leaders and executives and whatnot. If you plug all those comments into ChatGPT, for example, it can extract the main point out of every comment, as well as the name and the title and the company of the person who wrote that. And you can then have that compressed into sort of like an outline for an article that you then go and write. And I found it's very helpful because then when we talk about authority-led content marketing, one of the things that we look for is quotes from people in the field, right? People who are in the trenches doing that thing. But it can be hard to source some of those quotes. But if those people are having conversations on LinkedIn and the quotes are there, then you can there's the goal that you're looking for. And rather than going through and scrolling through one by one to try and extract, that's where AI comes in handy to help you do that in a flash.
Wow, that's incredible. I haven't used it for that, but it sounds very, very useful. I do use some apps that predate AI, but I think are very, very useful. Like I use Grammarly and Pro Writing Aid when I'm writing. I find that they're almost as good as a person in terms of editing. So it cuts down on the number of errors in things that you write. It's really, really helpful. And then I use Canva for graphic design, which I think was a game changer for marketing in general, 'cause prior to that, if I wanted anything done, I'd have to go through a graphic designer who has an hourly rate even for simple fixes. But with Canva, you can do very good designs that that fills most of what you need graphic design for, and you can do it very simply and quickly in the comfort of your own office.
Absolutely. I saw there were a lot of people who were using Canva to generate carousels using their AI feature. And I was like, see, this is smart. I think for me, the benefit of AI comes from thinking up these sort of edge use cases for how to use AI. There's the usual, yes, ask ChatGPT to generate an article for you. It's not going to be very good, but asking it to crunch through the notes that you've had from a call, like this one, for example, and to extract questions to ask against those notes. Now, that's an interesting use case. I don't think there's any tools around here that do that right now. Even the AI note takers don't really do that. So it's really just getting creative with AI. I think that's where the fun is.
Yeah, yeah. And how important is video in content marketing and social media in 2020?
I think people like to see people's faces. And that's probably why we're on this podcast as well, because we just love looking at our own mugs in the mirror. TikTok style videos, they seem to be all the rage right now. And people on LinkedIn also really enjoy seeing founders talk about the problem that they want to help customers solve. So there are a few leaders who are already sort of doing this on their own profiles. You think about Rand Fishkin, who does the 5 minute whiteboard video series. You think about Chris Walker, who takes snippets from his podcast and he puts that on LinkedIn. I think Yusuf Marie, you do that as well. Jeremy Shear, people enjoy videos. It adds an extra layer of density, I think, to the experience of listening to someone talk. So if I've been following Marie for a long time and I've been seeing her posts on my feed, and then I finally hear her talk, there's just a whole nother dimension to that. It's that thing of putting a voice and a face behind the name and behind the words. Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, one of the advantages is because AI is dominating so much right now, I think people might be starting to be skeptical and dubious about what they read online because they know it's not necessarily written by a person, whereas videos are very hard to fake. So I think that in the coming months and year, that if people are looking at content and they have to choose between, say, video and text, I think they'd prefer video because they know the person is real. They can get a general sense of the person. With a lot of videos, people will like the fact that you have a video, even though they don't necessarily watch it. Like, if it wasn't that a LinkedIn where you scroll through, you see a video and you think that looks interesting, you read the text and you say, "I'll watch it later." You like the fact they had a video, but, you don't ever actually you sometimes don't get around to actually watching it, and all a bit like that, and sometimes you just read the captions anyway. But I do think there is a huge value in having videos because it does help to create that trust and to help create a real connection with people, and it can speed up the s the speed at which they start working with you because they have a better sense of who you are as a person, what your brand is, and what you do, and how you solve their problems, which would take a lot longer than simply reading text, whether it be text posts on LinkedIn or articles on your blog.
Yeah, I agree. It reminds me of that whole thing of costly signaling theory, where it's like people enjoy the fact that you've put in so much effort to create something, and that in itself shows how much you believe in your product. Therefore, that earns you brownie points. So it's kind of like if, you know, Mo says his content writing is great, it's like whatever. Of course, he's going to say that. But if Mo goes out and takes a billboard out in the middle of Dublin, talking about content marketing from columncontent.com, now people start to take notice, even though they've never heard of the brand before. But the fact that they went out and got a billboard out is enough to show that they believe in the strength of their product. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, because that's very costly. And I think the same sort of principle applies to video. It takes time to do the outreach to people on LinkedIn. Hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast, to set up the scheduling, to send the link, to put together the questions, to stalk their websites and stalk their profiles to figure out topics, jump on here, sit with them for an hour as you've been doing. And after that, the job isn't done. You still need to take that video, cut it up, caption it, write posts about it, schedule it. There's a lot of work that goes into creating a single episode. And I think just doing that in and of itself shows that you really believe in the quality of your work and in the mission that you're doing. And that in and of itself is a reason to pay attention to people who do that.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that theory before, but it sounds interesting. I guess it'd be like if one of your friends came over to visit and they baked you cookies, like didn't just buy them, but bake them for you. You'd really like the fact that they baked them, even if you don't like cookies and even if you never eat them, you'd still like them more for going to the effort.
It's the effort. Yeah. Same reason why if you send a postcard to someone, it stands out a lot more than sending them a cold email, because it took you time to write that, send it in the post. And even though there's apps that do this right now, but it's just, you took that extra step, you went that extra mile. Therefore, I appreciate and recognize the effort. Yeah.
How will SEO change in 2024?
I think in 2024, SEO is going to double down on a lot more EEAT. So experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. And this goes back to what we're talking about earlier on, that people want to read from people who are talking from experience and not because they've scraped the SERPs and come up with a whole bunch of content they put together in an article. So, the trustworthiness and the authoritativeness, you can't speak to that if you haven't actually gone through the thing that you're going through, which unfortunately presents another chicken and egg problem. Because if you've never actually done the work, how do you generate the authority to speak on that well and to generate trust? But there are ways to break it. If you worked in house and you start your own business, then you're speaking from experience and you have some case studies because the clients that you worked with while in house, you did that work. So you can also talk about that in your new business. And if you're then doing SEO as a young startup, I think that's one place to start, is just speak about your own experience. If you're doing personal branding content on LinkedIn, what have you done in the past? And to speak more about how SEO is going to change in 2024, I think we're going to see a lot less fluffy intros. I wrote a piece about that, and it's a thing that I'm passionate about, because no one is more annoyed than someone who's looking for an answer but has to wade through a long contextual intro about what is X and why is X important. Like, we know, just jump into it. It's kind of like reading recipes online. Like, you want to know how to make lamb biryani, and the writer is talking about the recipe that her great grandmother wrote. And it's like, that's all fine, but can I just know how to make lamb biryani?
Yeah, I totally agree. You can search for something simple like what's Blake Lively's next film? And then you read an article that's a biography of her entire life, everything she's done up until now, where she lives, what she wears. And then at the very end, it's the title of her film, just the title. Whereas for me, I've always preferred articles that have the snippet at the start. I know that Google really likes the snippet, and if it's done right, the snippet can become a snippet in Google search itself, which is really, really useful. But I like it when they have like the TLDR at the start with the answer. And then you can put the same content there, because once people have the answer, they might stay or they might not. But there's no need to trick them into staying. It'll just make them dislike you. You might get more time on the page for that particular article, but they'll be much less likely to visit your website overall.
And much less likely to buy from you either, because now they trust you a little bit less than they did before the land.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there's definitely a lot of text on the web that's just written for SEO. A lot of it looks like, oh, they're going for a keyword. So they created a listicle that has no rhyme or reason, no reason for existing. It's just text from other articles. And it just purely exists for the sake of existing. I think that will carry much less weight in 2024. I do think, especially with AI and things, people have a higher standard. So they prefer to read something that's written by a person, and it can have their own experience, maybe some anecdotes, but that it looks like it was written for a person who's genuinely interested in the topic that they're writing about. So, Mo, when you're working on projects, how do you maintain your creativity?
Creativity. So what is this, like sources of inspiration, you'd say?
Sources of inspiration, yeah. And how do you get ideas? How do you brainstorm?
So one of the benefits, I think, of ADHD is that your brain is an automatic idea machine. So you're constantly just like mixing things up in here. I've been called a popcorn machine because the ideas shoot out. And the challenge is actually finding out which idea is good enough to start working with versus which ones to sort of let go. And how I then infuse that into the work that I do is trying to find interesting ways of saying the same thing in a new, novel, fresh way. So if I'm writing an article, for example, I want to talk about a story from somewhere that's relevant to that, to use it to make the point. I want to bring in analogies. I want to use metaphors, maybe an interesting turn of phrase. I recently watched a movie, the Fall of the House of Usher, and I loved the fact that it was written by it was based on the writings of Edgar Allan Poe, the poet, and it's got this very dark, almost Halloweeny vibe to it. And I said, that's fantastic. So then I try to turn that into a poem on SEO. And it's just these crossovers, I think, is what I really enjoy about content marketing, because you can say the same thing in a very interesting way. When you apply this to client work, I find that they tend to enjoy a fresh take on the same topic. So I'll give an example. If you're talking about sales quotas, I wrote a piece on sales quota not too many months ago. And what I did was I went and did some research on some of the banks that had been fined, heavily fined, because they had heavy sales quotas on their teams. And so you take that story and you use that to illustrate why it is incredibly dangerous for sales teams to have unrealistic quotas, because it damages the crowd. Then you start showing the cracks. You start showing how it damages morale. You start showing how it leads to people taking shortcuts. And it's the same thing. I could have written a very straightforward article about how to set sales quotas. But I think just being able to infuse that creativity in it makes it a little bit better to read. Where I get my creativity from, I read a lot, almost too much actually, because there's always something new and something interesting online. I'm subscribed to a whole bunch of newsletters from different fields. I'm subscribed to newsletters from engineering leaders, and newsletters from content marketing leaders such as yourself, newsletters from design leaders, developers, because I think inspiration almost never comes from your field. It comes from everywhere else. And if you're able to absorb these things and cross pollinate your mind with what's going on elsewhere, you can create some really powerful and impactful work.
Yeah, I agree. I think you get inspiration by doing. So, by interacting with people, particularly if they're in different industries, by reading and by learning, more so than sitting there with a blank page trying to come up with another idea. And like that, I love how, yeah, you could be sitting down watching TV, even a horror, props to Mike Flanagan, and get some ideas for content marketing from that. It's really impactful. Like if you have an article that's inspired by that, anyone else who's watched that TV show are bound to resonate and connect with it at a much deeper level than any other thing they're going to read or watch that day.
Yeah. There's an article by a UK-based content marketing agency they call Little Humans. And one of the articles I remember they wrote was what Mean Girls can teach us about content marketing. And it did fantastic. When we shared that in Slack groups, people were like, oh my God, this is so cool. Mean Girls was one of my favorite movies, and so on and so forth. And it just adds that extra layer of connection because anybody who's now watched that movie immediately can recognize the characters and they can draw the lessons themselves in the article as they're reading it. And I think more content like that is going to do wonders for our field as content marketers because people are tired of reading generic content and they crave something that says the same thing, teaches them something new, but in an interesting way. Just, hook their attention and don't bore them to tears with a keyword stuff article.
Yeah, I think a lot of people say things like people have lost their attention spans. I don't think they have. I think they've increased their bullshit meter. So if they're reading something online and it's clearly written just for the bots, just for SEO, or if it's written just for the sake of existing because the person wanted attention or views, people don't really engage with it. It's really boring. But if there's something that they're really interested in or something that resonates with them, they will watch an entire TV show on Netflix if it's good. They will watch a 40-minute TED Talk on YouTube if it's worthwhile. They will listen to a 16-hour audiobook in a week, no problem, if it's what they want to hear. So I think it's not so much that people, yeah, that they don't have the attention span. It's that you need to entertain them more, educate and write for the audience rather than just for the sake of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And thanks so much for joining me today. It was very interesting to get your insights for social media for 2024. If people want to get in touch with you, how would they do so?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is usually a good place to start. And you can learn more about the content marketing work that I do at columncontent.com.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Mary.
Thanks for tuning in to Witty Banter. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow, like, and share. You can get in touch by visiting the website wittybanter.com. That's witty-banter.com or follow Witty Banter on LinkedIn to get updates as they happen.